The U.S. Navy has gone through some dramatic changes during its 200-year existence. From the commerce raiders of the American Revolution to the mightiest military instrument afloat in the Second World War, the U.S. Navy has proven its ability to adapt to changing times. The war in Vietnam was no exception. Facing a foe that lacked all but the most rudimentary naval force, the Navy was called upon to meet many different challenges in a very complex environment. The story of the U.S. Navy in the Vietnam War is an important part of the wider saga of American involvement in Southeast Asia. When the U.S. military began its involvement in Vietnam during the 1950s, it was realized that the best means of carrying cargo and people in many parts of the country was by water. This was something the Viet Cong took full advantage of. U.S. Navy personnel worked with the South Vietnamese Navy along the coast and in the Mekong Delta, where they trained their Vietnamese counterparts in how to regulate coastal and river traffic. At the same time, the ships of the Blue Water Navy were involved in surveillance and electronic snooping off the North Vietnamese coast. It was here in international waters that direct conflict with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or the DRV, began. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was attacked by 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats. The Maddox sank one of the attackers while the others were driven off by aircraft from a nearby American carrier. Although not known to the American public at the time, the U.S. destroyer was sailing near the site of a South Vietnamese naval raid against the DRV, which provoked the North Vietnamese response. A second attack was reported to have occurred 2 days later against the Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, a second destroyer that had joined her. It was a stormy night, and there is considerable doubt that an attack actually occurred.
What they thought was a radar blip showing torpedo boats coming out to attack them. In retrospect, this one officer, and I think he was in CIC at the time, said he really thought it was sea return, which if you know radar, with surface radar, sometimes if the sea state has built up swells and so on, that can send a radar return back that to some operators that might not be that skilled might look like a surface ship, but it's not.
President Johnson used this second attack, known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, as a pretext to launch airstrikes against the North. He ordered his aircraft carriers into action. America officially entered the war in Vietnam on August 7, 1964, with Operation Pierce Arrow, a series of reprisal strikes against North Vietnamese naval bases and support facilities. The operation marked the beginning of a prolonged involvement by the U.S. Navy in the fighting in Southeast Asia. Cruising off the coast of what became known as Yankee Station, the aircraft carrier battle groups became to many the symbol of the U.S. Navy in Vietnam. This was the part of naval operations in Vietnam that received the most publicity and was best understood by the American public. Involved from the very beginning of open conflict, by March of 1965, daily air operations were being conducted against targets in both South and North Vietnam.
During this initial air campaign, the airstrikes that are being carried out in the South are designed to support the ground troops and those that are in direct combat with the insurgents. While the strikes that are going in against the North, they're designed as a club or a way to persuade the North Vietnamese to stop their support of the insurgency being carried out in the South.
Interdiction of troops and supplies bound for the South became part of this campaign. However, in the North, this was a carefully controlled war, and only those locations on the target lists approved by Washington could be attacked.
And we didn't strike any targets or launch any aircraft until we got approval, except some very low-level targets of opportunity, like we'd find a a truck, Army truck on the road or something, we were authorized to strike them. But POL dumps and transportation centers, hubs, we didn't strike those without their approval.
Always lurking in the background was the possibility of a wider war. It was only a few years since the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the very edge of nuclear annihilation, and it was felt that the Soviet Union and/or China might actively participate if provoked. Avoiding that provocation became paramount and served to limit the scope of the naval airstrikes. Yet even as the international chess game was being played out, operations at Yankee Station built to a crescendo of activity.
In the first 4 months I had commanded the ship, I had over 10,000 combat landings, which gives you an idea of the tempo of operations there.
This was not a strategic bombing campaign. We were busting bridges and highways, fuel dumps in the jungles, boats on the river. We were not allowed to strike in the big urban industrial areas like Haiphong or Hanoi or Hangzhou because the Russians kept the duty merchant ship in port at all times, and we weren't allowed to strike any Soviet equipment.
But in spite of restrictions, civilian targets were inevitably hit, and heavy casualties inflicted on the population. This was a major cause of criticism of U.S. policy, both at home and abroad. But in spite of criticism, Johnson was not about to curtail airstrikes against the North. The carriers and their planes, along with the Air Force, became Washington's bargaining tool with the North Vietnamese. Carrier strikes were used by Washington in an attempt to force the other side to accept its bargaining position, and would continue throughout the war, culminating with an all-out campaign in December of 1972 to force the North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front to accept U.S. conditions for withdrawal from the South. But that was years in the future, and from 1965 through 1971, aircraft continued to scream off the decks of carriers on Yankee Station and turn toward the hostile coast of Vietnam. Military operations in wartime are by their very nature dangerous. Even though the North Vietnamese could not seriously threaten U.S. warships sailing off the coast, the threat of attack could not be totally disregarded.
You would have to say that there's certainly a difference in the level of intensity that members of ship's company felt. There was only one time where I remember that we actually went to general quarters, and that was because we had gone quite far up into the Gulf of Tonkin, and there was concern that, well, maybe the North Vietnamese might try to send some airplanes out and attack us. Generally speaking, we were operating in what was considered a safe area as far as the ships were concerned. Now, of course, for the pilots, whenever they left the ship on an operation flying over Vietnam, they were going into combat, and it was always a life or death situation for them. They never knew if that day their number might be up.
When the naval airstrikes began in the wake of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, they went in against fairly weak air defenses. However, the North Vietnamese soon established a formidable air defense system built around Soviet-made anti-aircraft guns, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG interceptors. Jumps and starts in the bombing raids, well-defined strike areas, as well as continued Soviet and Chinese support with increasingly sophisticated weapons.
Situation with twin Ford 427 interceptor engines and jacuzzi pumps on them could just get out and flat move in a hurry, which they had to do quite often, I guess.
SEAL teams prepared for their missions in every way possible and were some of the only American forces to continue rigorous physical training while in base camp between missions. This fact, combined with constant briefings, kept the SEALs at peak efficiency. Whether slipping ashore from a small boat or put in by a larger landing craft, which would stop at several places to deceive the enemy and obscure the patrol's real location, The patrol usually used stealth and field craft to track and gather intelligence on their elusive foe.
I think we like to think of the SEALs being 6'9" and, all look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Most of the SEALs were smaller stature. I'd say that they had a 5'4" to 5'9", wiry guys, tough as nails. I mean, they could run for 20 miles and hardly take a breath. I mean, they were great. Their operations were mostly recon. Sometimes they were set out to assassinate certain chieftains and villages. Quite often went out in black pajamas, but using Chi-Com weapons, and would just infiltrate different areas.
Unlike most American forces in Vietnam, the SEAL teams were able to operate and use the night to actually meet the enemy on his own ground and his own terrain. And the SEALs were very effective, especially in the Delta area and the areas around the rivers in South Vietnam.
Once the patrol had accomplished its mission, they would generally move back to a canal, set up a perimeter, often setting booby traps or charges for unwelcome visitors. Soon, a Navy landing craft would arrive and retrieve the small team. Hours or days of tension washed away as the team relaxed on the relatively safe haven of the Navy landing craft and returned to base. There they were debriefed by the team leader on the completed mission, and the intelligence gathered was passed on. Often the debriefing officers might make an aerial reconnaissance over the area in a helicopter to see if larger unit operations could be conducted to go after the enemy forces identified by the SEAL team. The Army and Navy combined to form an effective answer to the question of how to place and support a force large enough to take on the enemy in the formidable terrain of the Delta. This unit was known as the Riverine Force and was designed specifically for the conditions encountered in Vietnam. The swamps and mangrove tangles of the Mekong Delta that made it difficult for conventional forces to operate led to the development of the Joint River Assault Group. This was the ultimate extension of the fleet in the inland waters and was truly the backbone of the Brown Water Navy.
One of the most remarkable and successful innovations that occurs in the Vietnam War is the formation of the Joint Riverine Force, which is the Army and the Navy cooperating and working together to effectively meet the enemy in the Mekong Delta area with both river and ground forces. And this success and the idea of the services working together in a joint way is one of the lessons that the military will carry forward from Vietnam and learn from, and the highlight and begin to really emphasize the use of joint operations.
The Navy component consisted of a number of specially modified craft built to perform the role of larger ships during these inland amphibious operations. The battleships of the Inland Navy were the LCM gunboats, or monitors. These specialized vessels were armored and designed for one purpose: to close in to shore and fight it out with the enemy.
We had three. One of them was called a Zippo. It had flamethrowers mounted on both sides. The other one had a minigun mounted on it, and the other one mounted a 105 to use to put beehive rounds in. But the good thing was a lot of firepower.
The river monitors were responsible for screening the landing of the infantry and then supporting the operations of the troops ashore. The least glamorous of the inland fleet were the armored troop carriers that delivered the waterborne infantry to the battle area. Armed only for defense, their role was to deliver the troops, provide supplies, and retrieve the soldiers when the operation was over.
You'd be going down these rivers, one boat after the next, wagon train style, with dense forest on both sides, just feet away. Then, well, there was a couple times, of course, on that where you can say all hell broke loose. And it's deafening, the amount of firepower put out by the Navy.
The Army was represented by the 9th Infantry Division, which operated from a floating base camp in the river.
Our battalion moved from Dongtam onto the Mobile Riverine Force, onto the ships in the middle of the Mekong River. And that was the elite place to be, because you had all the water you wanted. You had it hot or cold. The Navy cooks would decorate the food. You know, you go through there, the best food and all the milk you wanted. It was like we felt bad for the guys on land because they didn't have all the supplies that we had.
We did joint operations with the 9th Infantry, and actually we had operations that we took people in on with landing craft. We had the Popular Forces, which was the local armies like a militia, and 9th Army. And the SEALs would do the recon, set up the ambush, and they'd do an old hammer and anvil trick and try to push the VC into a spot, and then they'd use the RAG fleet, the monitors and stuff with the tank turrets for their artillery base, mobile artillery, and they try to force the VC down into those things and block them off.
These operations could last hours or days as the boats of the Brownwater Navy stood by in support. At the completion of an operation, the boats would move into a predetermined location and wait for the assault force to slog out and rejoin the boats. Downriver, they would unload at their floating base and be checked aboard and prepared to go out again. In addition to operations with the 9th Infantry Division, the Riverine Force was also utilized to assist other units, including Special Forces and the indigenous soldiers they led.
They saved us one time. We were surrounded, had nowhere to go, and the next morning the boats had come in and parked by the river, so we took off at them, and they were firing, they had 40 millimeter and 20 millimeter guns on there, and they were shooting right over our head. And to this day, I will buy a sailor a beer if I can. We get on that boat, I was stepping on my tongue, and the chief of the boat said, you know what you need? I said, no, what do I need? He said, you need a cold beer. I said, do you guys have beer on this boat? He said, yep, only Navy vessel allowed to carry beer.
As the American involvement in Vietnam wound down in the early 1970s, more and more of the Navy's small boat and coastal operations became part of the Vietnamization process. In this period, American sailors turned over their boats and the bases that supported them to the South Vietnamese.
There was this transition period where the Vietnamese were riding the boats with us or being on watch with us, and then we were slowly turning that responsibility over so that we would do most of the activity, and then a month later maybe the Vietnamese were doing most of the activity where we were just coaching them.
Shortly after I left country, they were turning over our patrol boats to the Vietnamese Navy, and I think that was kind of the beginning of the end. But you know, fighting boats, my friends John Purley sent me a picture of one of the boats with that had been a fighting boat and was coming by with a Vietnamese crew, and had laundry hanging between the antennas and chickens running around on the deck, and you know, it didn't quite look the same.
Naval operations, increasingly carried out by the Vietnamese toward the end of America's commitment to the war in Vietnam, represented some of the most successful innovations made to adapt to the situation and terrain of Vietnam. Adaptation was the byword of the U.S. Navy's involvement during the long and brutal war in Southeast Asia. It was the ability of the U.S. Navy to successfully adapt to unfamiliar circumstances that marked naval operations during the Vietnam War.
We did it to the best of our ability. It was an 18-hour day job. You're lucky to squeeze in 6 hours to sleep. You went 75 days without a beer at times. But it was our job. We loved our country. We loved our job. We loved our Navy.
There's a special sense of dedication and honor and camaraderie and you know, and community and everything else that takes place, and I think people are envious of that.
We were actually there to try to preserve freedom for those people, and they were worth it.